Thanks everyone for coming along. Good morning and welcome to another session of the Friday morning seminars. Before we begin, I'd just like to, on behalf of the University of Queensland, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay our respects to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. Today is a special edition of our seminar series dedicated to Alban Lynch, the founding director of the JKMRC. Alban not only founded our institution, but he pioneered our approach to doing research on site and working hand in hand with industry. Speaking today is Alban's son, Martin. Martin has a Bachelor of Chemical Engineering degree from UQ. He worked in various operational and corporate roles at Rio Tinto over 12 years, followed by 6 years of consultancy work in the mining industry. And since 2009 has run a business selling and installing renewable energy systems. Martin has also written several books looking at mining history, taking after his father, and how global economic developments drive mineral demand. To mark the occasion, two former directors of the JKMRC, and Don McKee and Tim Napier-Munn, have also agreed to say a few words about Alban. I'd also like to acknowledge Susie Watson-Lynch, Alban's daughter, who's here today, and Rom Friesen and wife Sasha, who were also close friends of Alban, who are in attendance. I'll now hand over to Don. And then Tim will close things out before we commemorate this occasion with a morning tea. Thanks, Don.
Thank you, Kim. Good morning, everyone. Yes, it's a special day, but before I mention a few things about Alban, I want to acknowledge the passing of T.C. Rao. Rao was Alban's first PhD student. The year was 1962, and that was the year when the P9 project, on which the JK was based and grew, that was the year it commenced. Rao was newly arrived from India. He was 21 or 22. He came into the department, as it then was, of mining metallurgical engineering, and he was assigned to Alban, and as Alban, or Rao himself said, he'd never seen a cyclone, but he was given the cyclone to work on. That was in the very early days of Alban setting out to model grinding circuits. Why was Rao important? He was important, I think, for two reasons. He obviously developed with Alban the cyclone model, which was the basis, the missing link in simulation of grinding circuits. But equally importantly, he was the first student, he was the pioneer of students going out to mines and literally spending months and months there. And in Rao's case, it was at Mount Isa. That's where he collected the data. What he established was the way students worked for time immemorial almost here. So immensely important man, and we honour his memory, recent as it is. A couple of words about Alban, and I want to try and say something many of you won't know. Almost exactly 30 years ago, 30 years and about 3 months, this building was opened. Big, great occasion for the JK at the time. Quite possibly the only other person who was at that event, I might be wrong, is Tim and myself. Anyway, and Susie, sorry, Susie, on that occasion, Alban spoke, not surprisingly, and Alban was a man who chose his words very carefully when he spoke. And I'm quoting from memory, but he said, amongst other things, his 4 rules for success in research. The first, I'm paraphrasing, and I'm pretty sure my memory is right. My first rule, engage with the industry. Second rule, tackle the big problems and forget about the small ones. Third rule was put faith in postgrad students. And the fourth was stay away from the university as far as possible, which I certainly did, and so did Tim. I think it's harder now. But anyway, in those days, it was very possible. He said that was the lessons of the first 10 years. And he chose 10 carefully, and that would have been right at the time. If he'd said the first 20 years, I think he would have added two more things. He would have said, look, don't sit doing the same thing endlessly. Go out looking for new, big opportunities and never be put off in chasing those opportunities if you don't have the expertise to tackle the problem. You'll develop it. And this is the last bit of that story, and nothing ever spells that out better than really the next big movement of the JK, which was into blasting. Now, the JK knew nothing about blasting as far as Alban was concerned. Blasting was merely the first stage of comminution. Who did he put in charge of? A feasibility study was done by a metallurgist, the late Graham Walter. Amira came in on the act. The Amira blasting project came about called P93 in 1978. Who was it run by? He chose a young metallurgist, Cameron Mackenzie. What did Cameron know about blasting? 3/4 of nothing. It didn't matter. Cameron was immensely successful. The project grew. By the mid-80s, it was the biggest project in the JK Centre. There's never been a larger project with 40 sponsors, 36 of whom all required field work all over the world. Quite stunning. That was Alban's mantra. Keep on looking for the big things, go after them, and don't be daunted if you don't know anything about it. I can't think of, that's one of his great legacies to the JK and to mining and minerals research everywhere. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Don. And do I have to? Thanks, Don and Kim, for those words of introduction. The topic I want to talk about today is sort of like a distillation of a few books that I wrote some years ago. I was interested in the question of the China mining boom and sort of why it happened, because it had come sort of out of nowhere and it was a big deal consuming the mining industry. And it just made me wonder, well, where did this come from? And when it's over, will there be another one? And, you know, when you start thinking about that issue, you start to think, well, have there been mining booms before that? So I started to sort of go back a bit in time. And those all resulted in a couple of books that were published a couple of years ago. Now, I used to talk to my father quite a bit about these things because he was really quite interested in this subject. You know, he's obviously a technical guy, but you know, particularly as time went on, his interests kind of broadened, and he even wrote a couple of history books himself on the subject. So, you know, I know that this topic was an interest to him. Now, the talk's going to be in 3 sections. I'm going to talk about the global mineral demand in the 20th century, firstly, and talk a bit more specifically about the 15 years or so in which the China mining boom unfolded. And then I'm going to look to the future and see, well, make a couple of predictions or forecasts about what might happen up until the year 2050. Now, before I move on to section 1, just want to introduce the notion of regions of the world. Now, the China boom would never have happened if it wasn't in China. No, well, if it was, and the reason I say that is that China is a very large country. Now, if the same sort of thing that happened in China had happened in, say, Cambodia, you wouldn't even have seen anything because it's just too small. So in order to sort of get a handle on how, you know, future mining booms could come about, we need to break the world up into big pieces, hence the notion of regions. Now, I'm just going to show you what regions I've focused on. Obviously, there's China, which is a single country. There's India. Then there's a sort of a group called the advanced countries, which I'll come back to in a minute. And then I think the other four are pretty self-explanatory: Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, which includes Bangladesh and Indonesia, that sort of region. Kazakhstan to Morocco is a group of similar countries in terms of their political structures and their cultural structures that range from sort of Central Asia all the way through to Northern Africa. And then finally, there's Latin America. Now, the reason those groupings have been chosen is that in each group, the countries have similar political makeups. They're at similar stages, by and large, in terms of their economies, and their cultural and demographic makeups are also similar. But obviously, there's a lot of differences between them. But, you know, look at China, there's a lot of differences even between, you know, China as a country. So they're not totally homogeneous areas, but they're all big enough and similar enough to be treated as single entities. The advanced countries is the only one where there's some quite geographically disparate areas. And so it includes Western Europe or Europe as a whole, and then what's called, or sometimes called, the European offshoots, which is the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. But it also includes, really for the sake of, partly of convenience, of the advanced countries in Northeast Asia, so Japan, Korea, Taiwan. Okay, so I'm going to refer, the reason I raise these regions is I'm going to refer to them as we go along. So I just wanted you to know what I'm talking about. One thing I will add is that in 2015, the population was 7.4 billion in the world. Now it's 8.1 billion. So the population's rising at about 1% a year, which is striking, really. It's pretty fast. Now I'm going to move on to section 1, and I'll start with this table. So as I said at the beginning, I was interested in the mining boom of China. And so well, have there been any mining booms previously? And the answer is, well, yes, there have. You can read this obviously yourself, but I'm just going to explain a few things. Looking firstly at the years. The first mining boom was between 1900 and 1929. Now, as a matter of fact, it's really started in about 1880. It's just that the data that goes before 1900 starts to become a little bit unreliable in the sense that it's not derived on the same basis as the data from 1900. So I just started at 1900. And for those of you who know history, which I'm sure is most of you, the year 1929 is when the Great Depression began. So the first mining boom went from about 1880 up to 1929, 30 years. Now, the China mining boom lasted 15 years. So you can see that, no, not 30 years, 50 years. So the first mining boom lasted 50 years. China, 15 years. Then there was a period of the Great Depression where there wasn't really a lot of growth at all. And I've missed out the Second World War years because they're a bit confusing in the sense that there was an extremely rapid pickup in production. And then when the war finished, there was basically an extremely rapid deceleration. So it just confuses the issue. So I've left those years out. The years between 1950 and 1975 are what's sometimes called the post-war boom. And you can see once again, global mineral demand was very rapid, pretty much the same as in the first boom. And then post 1975, and what I'll kind of refer to the Thatcher-Reagan type era, things have slowed down quite a bit. Steel and copper are the two metals that I've sort of chosen to represent that. But and it's mainly because steel and copper have been fundamental parts of the the industrialization process for a long time. And so you can put in other metals like aluminium and nickel, but they're really only just come along more recently than that. Steel, 5% per year in the boom years, and then dropping down below 1% when things slow down. And copper, around 4.5% in the boom years and slowing down. In the 1975 to 2000 period, copper production or consumption was still fairly high, and that's because of all the communications that were being put in at that time. All right, now the mineral demand was dominated by the advanced countries right through the 20th century. And the high growth periods are basically caused by urbanisation. And when urbanisation slows down, that's when things slow down. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But before I go on to it, I just want to talk about a general kind of model of how countries develop. Now, I'm talking about now the advanced economies, Germany, the USA, those sorts of places. Every economy at the beginning is in what's called an agricultural stage. So they're basically a whole bunch of inefficient farms, 80% at least of the population lives on those. And then there's a smaller group, 20% or so, that live in cities, and they live off the surplus from the farming, and things just go along like that. At some point, though, the farms become more efficient. Fertilizers get introduced, farming machinery gets introduced, and all of a sudden, the farms become a lot more efficient. And when that's happening, all of these surplus farm workers who are no longer needed move to the cities, because the cities have got jobs in them, and they're manufacturing, construction, all sorts of jobs. So you get a shift from the farm to the city, and it's kind of a virtuous circle in that in the city, the machinery for the farming is being made, and so the workers move in there. They're basically low-wage jobs, and on they go to make more machinery, which is put into transport systems and so on, and it builds up like that. At some point, though, you've got a whole bunch of people. The farms are highly mechanised. You've got a whole bunch of people, about 50% of the population in the cities, and they're all lowly paid workers. And you need a second stage to, well, how do we keep the economy growing? All right, so to move into this to the second stage, which I've called the household stage, it means what's needed is to transfer the wealth from the rich group, which has benefited in the first stage in the urban stage, and sort of spread it across the lower paid people. And so they've got money to spend on what the factories can produce, because by the time you finish the urban stage, you've got quite a powerful factory unit, which is able to produce a lot of stuff. And if there's no one to buy that stuff, then things are going to slow down, which is what they start doing. So the second stage begins, the household stage begins when the policies that are put in place by government and so on spread the wealth across the sort of the common people. And when that happens, the process of suburbanisation begins. So you've got a whole bunch of people who are living in small sort of cramped tenement houses, low-paid workers. They start to move out into the suburbs. They've now got space. They can build houses. They have the ability to sort of put consumer goods in those houses. They've got the money. They can buy cars, and to get them from the suburbs into the city where they work and so on. So you get that sort of dynamic, which is when the second, rapid growth period occurs. At some point though, and this happened in the 70s in the advanced economies, that process too will slow down, and you need yet another impetus to economic growth. And in this case, what came along was two things. The first thing was a political change, which is the Thatcher-Reagan years. And the second one was the computer. And the combination of those two things kicked off a sort of a boom in services. So instead of the economy being driven by the consumption of material goods, you've got it driven by services and the growth in services. So that's pretty much how the advanced economies have progressed. And we're now pretty much at the end of stage 3 in the advanced economies. And one thing about when you get to the end of stages is that transitioning to the new stage isn't easy. And you can see with all the sort of political turmoil we have at the moment, we're going through that process right now. Okay, but I want to talk about the transitions, because all of this is going to be relevant when I come back and start to explain how these mining booms occurred and what will happen in the future. Okay, so transitions are not easy. Whilst all economies tend to follow the same sequence of stages, that path is not easy. Now, in particular, the transition between stage 1, which is the urban, and stage 2, which is the household stage, has never been easy for anyone. Now, the attempts that have been made to make those transitions have variously resulted in the Great Depression, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and what we've seen. And in fact, the countries in Latin America have never actually really made that transition. I'll talk about the Great Depression first and what happened there. By the time the end of the 1920s, a Model T Ford could be made in 93 minutes. The factory system in the US and elsewhere was extremely powerful. That they could make a heap of stuff, and without many people. It was very efficient. And what the problem was is that you've got a whole bunch of people who are living in tenement houses, cramped in cities, and they've got nowhere to put a car. They can't buy a car, even though if they wanted, if it was possible, the entire economy or all of the households in America could have bought a couple of cars. So that was the problem. You've got a very efficient factory system and no one to buy it. And there had long been an assumption, particularly through the 1920s, that, well, this growth that we're seeing here is going to go on forever. It's gone on since 1880, so it's going to continue to go. And then all of a sudden, a realization sunk in that it wasn't going to continue. And that's when the Wall Street crash happened. And you've got a whole bunch of people who can't buy the various goods that the factories can produce. So the factories started closing down. And that's what caused the Great Depression. So what hadn't happened is the transfer of wealth from the rich to the poor hadn't been done. And it was only when it was done, and that happened after the Second World War, because the Second World War, being such a traumatic event, actually forced countries to sort of reevaluate where they were. To do that in a sort of normal democratic setting, like where we are now, is not easy, because people don't like change. But when you've got an event like the Second World War, people sort of don't have a choice. That change is made for you. And so that's how the Great Depression ended with the Second World War. Now, the Soviet Union was the same thing, whereas you've got the urban stage beginning in the 1930s, and the country rapidly growing in terms of its industrial might. But by the time the sort of end of the 60s came around, you've got a very strong manufacturing country. You know, they're second in the world in the production of most things. But what had happened is you've got a whole bunch of basically Stalinist ideologues at the top of the Soviet Union, and they think, well, this is just fine. You know, we're going to keep making bridges and dams and make steel and cement. They liked it. It was a comfortable thing for them. But what the country was saying is that we're not getting anything out of this. Now, I'm actually married to a Russian, and she tells me that she grew up in she was living in a sort of a smallish Russian city when she was growing up. And the hotel room I'm staying in was bigger than her entire apartment. And she had 4 people in the house. There was a brother and her who had the 2 bedrooms. And you had to sort of walk like this past the bed. There wasn't much room in either of them. And then her parents were on a fold-out couch in the living room. And these were not poor people. I mean, both her mother and her father worked in quite senior jobs. But that's how people were living in a country that was already quite prosperous. So what had happened is that the common people and their ability to buy stuff had been forgotten. And what the leadership of the Soviet Union wouldn't do was change their priorities. And as a result, as someone put it, you know, the Soviet Union had got to the point where the factories and the companies pretended to pay their workers and the workers pretended to work. So nothing was going on, and economically the whole thing just collapsed because they wouldn't shift their priorities. And so that's another example of where moving from one economic stage to the other results in a disaster. Now, there are plenty of other places, Latin America being one of them, where that transition has never actually occurred. I'll come back to that in a bit. So then, having said all of that, just to put into words or to apply that to the previous table, between 1900 and 1929, that was when the farms were being mechanised, the cities were being built, and there was an urban factory base, a continent-wide railway system, and so on. So things were really moving. When it came to the low period, the Great Depression, the factory system was too efficient. It had too easily produced what consumers could not, well, what the consumers could afford to buy, and it produced a lot more than what they could afford to buy. So things slowed down. 1950 to 75, there was basically the New Deal in America and all the post-World War II sort of welfare policies which spread the wealth. So people could afford to move out to the suburbs and buy consumer goods. And finally, then we moved in the low period where the emphasis came off the acquisition of material goods and building of cities, and it focused more on services, where we saw a slowdown again in the consumption of minerals. Okay, so hopefully that explains the booms of the 20th century. And I'm now going to move on to the China boom. But before I do that, it wasn't only the advanced countries that actually urbanized during the 20th century. 2 regions, Latin America and Kazakhstan, Morocco, also urbanized. And in fact, Latin America had 50% of its population living in cities by about the 1950s. By the 1970s. And the same thing can be said for the Kazakhstan, Morocco. So not all economies urbanize in the same way. And you can see one measure of how you urbanize is the intensity of steel use and the intensity of copper use. So the advanced countries urbanized in a far more metal intensive way than did Latin America or Kazakhstan, Morocco. And so the reason I said the 20th century consumer demand was driven by the advanced countries, it wasn't the only area that was urbanizing, but it was the only area that was urbanizing with any great intensity of metal consumption. And I'll come back to why that happens on in the next slide. And just while we're talking about all that, you can see why the China boom had such a big impact, because it was highly metal intensive and in a very large country. So, but you can see there's a contrast there with India. You can see how low it is. India is also going through its urbanization stage, but its use of metals is very small. And there are reasons for that. Southeast Asia is sort of a little bit better than or higher than India, but it's also quite low. And then you come to sub-Saharan Africa, and you can see that nearly half the people in sub-Saharan Africa live in cities. And yet its consumption of metal is extremely low. In fact, what really is the case is that in sub-Saharan Africa, you've got a region which is still in the agricultural stage. It hasn't really moved into what I would describe as an urban stage of economic development. What you've had instead is far improved healthcare and just too many people being born and having to, and simply the farm system just can't support them. So they move off into the cities. Not really much is happening in the cities. They're more like sprawling residential areas. They're not really urban centres in the way that the advanced countries develop. Okay, now why is that? There's a couple of reasons. Firstly, the stage of economic development is a factor in what the intensity of metal use is going to be. But more importantly, rate of GDP growth impacts it, which is why China growing at 10% a year was such a high consumer of metals. But the other two very important factors, and this does vary by region, is that when you have high-rise buildings and a lot of infrastructure being built, such as in China, then you get a very high use of metals. And it's the same with manufacturing. And again, China, as you all know, is kind of like the workshop of the world. And so the bigger the factory system, the higher the metal intensity, which is why Latin America, with its pretty low rise urban development and not a particularly big factory system, hasn't been using much metal in its urbanization. Now, I'm going to go to China now. So we've looked at the 20th century and the mining booms which happened then. Now look at the China boom. So it took metal consumption back up to pretty much the size of the previous mining booms. There's a detail. There's an asterisk there which says copper 5% asterisk. In fact, copper was supply constrained through the period, and people here will know more about that than I do, as to why. But you couldn't get enough copper out of the ground, and what the 5% is what it would have been had there been enough copper. But in fact, there was a lot of substitution of copper with aluminium, with polypiping, that sort of thing, because you just couldn't get enough copper out of the ground. And so the China boom pushed the consumption of metals back up to the level of previous mining booms. Now, I want to talk in the next few slides about what happened in China and why things unfolded the way they did. I could talk in a fair bit of detail about this, but I'm just going to sort of be pretty brief about it. One way of looking at China's development is to look at the stages it went through. And the first decade, the 1980s, so the China mining boom essentially started, as far as we could see it, back in sort of 2003 when the prices went through the roof. But in reality, it started in the 1980s, the early 1980s. Chairman Mao died in 1976, and he was a hard man. What he wanted happened. when he died, one of the things that was on everyone's mind was the people are going to rise up here. There's going to be a revolution because we haven't done anything for them. You know, there'd been no change in the material prosperity of the people since the communist revolution back in there'd been some change, but not much. And not only that, they'd lost their farms because they'd been communalised, and they had the Cultural Revolution where they were told what they had to think. And so the people were pretty unhappy about it. And so when Mao died, there was a group, fortunately, a group of quite capable people who said, right, we've got to do something about this. And so the first thing they did was give the farms back to the people. And the second, and that was a very popular policy, and it was partly introduced because they introduced a very unpopular policy, which is the one-child policy. Both of those happened in 1978. Anyway, so the giving of the farms back to the people kicked off a boom kicked off an economic boom in the countryside, and that bore China along for the 1980s. At the same time, back in the early 80s, there was a second economic reform which was done, the special economic zones, which opened up trade to the world, and that took a lot longer to sort of come into to have any effect. But by the 1990s, it was having an effect. So the second decade of China's sort of development was dominated by, or driven along by, the establishment of factories, which were mainly, or a large number of them were for export. What really started, though, the mining boom was the third decade, and that was when. And I'll talk about that in a minute as to why it happened. But there was a building boom which was triggered in China's cities, and so what you had was 3-4 story kind of brick, very cramped accommodation, and it went from being cramped accommodation to being high-rise buildings. And you know, there was a comment made by some guy that 25% of the world's cranes are in Shanghai back in the sort of mid 2000s, and that was a degree of what the building was going on. So the third decade of China's transformation was the building of high-rise buildings right through the cities, and then the fourth decade was sort of an attempt by the Chinese, policymakers to keep things going, and things started to slow down. I mean, you can't just build forever. So they put in a stimulus package, which basically encouraged the building to keep going. And so that's how the mining boom happened in one sense. In the outside world, you didn't see it until 2003, but that really strong economic growth was going on for years before. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this too long because there's a bit of detail there, but in essence, China really had created its own problems to begin with by keeping the people kind of repressed with quite, and there's not, you can debate the merits of socialism and all the rest of it, but it's what had happened was the Chinese government had pretty much taken away from the people their ability to decide things for themselves. And in a way, the China boom was caused by the government of the day taking away those restrictions progressively and freeing up the Chinese people. The things I've highlighted in red there are the most effective policies that were put in place. And all of them have to do with the ownership of property or housing. And once people could do that, make decisions over their own farm or make decisions over what they wanted to do with their house, things really started to move. Probably the most important, or the policy that triggered the China mining boom, as far as the outside world could see it, was enacted in the late 90s, and that was when the problem that was encountered, or the policy change that was directed at the problem of underperforming city businesses. So you've got all these Mao era businesses which are providing education and housing to their workers. The workers can't be sacked, and you've basically got businesses providing welfare to their workers. Now, they weren't very dynamic businesses. They were basically welfare states. And the realization had sunk in with the Chinese, and that they can see these privately owned businesses, often Western owned, booming, thriving. And alongside them, there's all these Chinese businesses which aren't doing anything. And they said, all right, we've got to change this. But there was a lot of fear about doing that, because they'd had the Tiananmen Square demonstrations not all that long before. And that was caused by far less disruption than what would happen if you reformed these businesses and took their welfare provisions away. So they were worried about it. But anyway, what happened was that they bit the bullet and said, all right, these businesses don't have to provide welfare anymore. The one thing that they said, and by the way, you guys, you workers, you have to own your own house. And they kind of thought that was going to be a bad thing, because the houses weren't very big. They weren't maintained. It's just that they didn't want the businesses to have to maintain them anymore. But so they said to the workers, all right, you can buy your own apartment for not much money. And little did they know that having done that, that triggered what happened was that people then said, all right, well, I can own my own house. Now, I could rent it out to one of these migrant workers who's just come in off the farm. And with my savings, plus the rent that I get, I can buy a better house. And that's the dynamic that was triggered. And it didn't take long for it to develop into a building boom. So that is what triggered the mining boom as we see it. Although, as I said, that kind of development, the very rapid economic growth had been occurring long before that. All right, so now, you know, you're probably all well aware that China's slowing down and has slowed down quite a bit. But there's still plenty of potential there, like a heap of potential. People don't own their farms, and Chinese farms on average are 1 hectare. You know, in Australia, they're 50,000 hectares, and in Latin America, they're huge. They're very small farms. And what that does is it keeps a lot of people on the farms, and it reduces the efficiency of the farms. So one thing that can be done as a sensible reform is that you can give ownership of the farms to the people, and then they can buy and sell it. But that's not being done because, I'll come to why that's not being done in a minute. There's a bunch of other reforms that can be done, which each of them would trigger a lot of economic growth. But the Chinese Communist Party is very reluctant to do it. And so what we're seeing is a typical example of a transition from the end of the urban stage to the household stage. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't want to relinquish its power. And so it's not undertaking the reforms that would put purchasing power and economic power into the hands of the common people. And it's a classic case of being unable to make the transition from the urban stage to the household stage. Now, there's some other problems in China which are going to make its sort of economic performance a lot more difficult. It's got an aging population, and pretty soon the workforce will be in decline. Now, that's happened in Japan. You know, the Japanese workforce is declining as we speak, and it has been for a while. So it happens, you know, and it's going to happen here soon. It's just that in China, it's still going through its urbanization stage. So there's still a lot of economic development to do. And that is not easy to do when you have an aging, declining workforce. There used to be a supportive and tolerant international environment. That's gone, largely due to what the Chinese have done themselves. And production costs are rising. So what you've got is a whole bunch of issues which are pushing back the Chinese economy. And from what I can see, it's going to perform very poorly over the next 30 years until the Communist Party says, all right, enough, we're going to take a back seat here. But that's not going to happen. And the reason is Xi Jinping is in power with a mindset similar to Chairman Mao, and that is to control the economy, not to loosen the controls on the economy. So if we're looking for the next China boom, well, it's not going to come from China, not until things change, and that probably won't be by 2050. All right, so where will it come from? So let's start looking at these regions that I talked about. People say, well, India could be the next China. Well, it could be. It's got a lot of people working on inefficient farms, and it's got a long history of sort of social developments. One of the things that allowed China to develop so rapidly is that they had a lot of sort of muscle memory. They built the Great Wall in like 2,000 years ago, and it was a country used to social order and progress. So when the restrictions on the Chinese population were lifted, it wasn't sort of a new thing for them. They were just coming back to where they'd been. India's kind of similar to that. Now I'll just talk to the points I've got there. India's urban stage began in the mid-80s. It used to, prior to that, it was similar to the Chinese situation. It was very heavily controlled, and it was called the license Raj, and as opposed to the British Raj, because licenses ruled the economy. You couldn't do anything. It wasn't a communist state, but it was a heavily regulated state. And along came a couple of reformers, and they changed all that and said, all right, let's take these licenses away. And India since then has been in something of a boom. But it's mainly a retail boom and telecommunications. It's not actually a fundamental economic boom at all. There's been zero land reform. And in fact, there was a recent attempt at land reform, which was to give the land to the people. And it was vociferously pushed back on, and they abandoned the plan. So what you're not seeing there is any real fundamental change impacting and benefiting the majority of the population. Manufacturing is very poor in India. And the reason for it is that if you try to build a factory, once you get above 100 people, you are into highly regulated territory. You can't sack anyone, all this sort of stuff. So people sort of resist doing that. You can't get any land in the cities. Now, you can, of course. It's just that, as a general rule, it's very difficult to do this stuff. And so the reforms that are needed to enable India to become the next China have not been made. And there's not really any great prospect of them being made until they are. These things can change pretty quick, as it did in China. But at the moment, the outlook for India is not particularly bright, in my opinion. And you can see that's reflected in the intensity of metal use. It's a very light sort of industrialization. There's high-rises being built and all the rest of it, but there's not that many of them. What India is good at is business services. And that's really where their boom is coming from. With a business service business, though, you don't need manufacturing. All you need is a single or one or two floors in an office building and some Wi-Fi. They're pretty easy to develop in that sense. So you keep the businesses small, put in Wi-Fi, and off you go. And that's what those businesses can prosper, because there's a lot of wealthy Indians who speak quite good English. And so that's where the business services come in. So what you got here is India's development is really focused on the wealthy 20% of the people. It's nothing like what China did. and it's not going to be in the foreseeable future. So I don't think India is going to give us any economic or mineral China boom over the period to 2050. Well, let's have a look at the other regions. And I could go through blow by blow, but I'm not going to. Looking at Latin America and Kazakhstan to Morocco. Now, both of those countries or regions urbanized or rapidly. So you had 50% of the people living in cities by about 1970, around that time, the mid-70s. And they haven't really gone on to do much since. The reason is that for different reasons in both cases, they haven't been able to restructure the economy to give the purchasing power to the poorer people. In Latin America, I tend to think it's a political issue, that you've got a very wealthy elite and the army, and they see these liberalisation policies as being destabilising and dangerous to the economy, or potentially detrimental. Now, there is risks in doing whatever anyone's going to do. And it's long been recognised in Latin America that some sort of liberalisation is needed, but it's never done effectively. And so what you've got is a whole bunch of countries who are just getting by or just continuing in their fairly low speed economic development, well behind the advanced countries. One exception to that's probably Mexico. And the reason Mexico is a bit different is that it's quite closely tied to the American economy. There's a lot of manufacturing there, which is unusual in Latin America. And it's sort of, to some extent, it's a hybrid economy. Half of it's in Latin America, half of it's in North America. And so you've got stronger economic growth in Mexico than elsewhere. In Kazakhstan, Morocco, the reason it hasn't done anything much is that by the time, the people, the mid-70s, everyone, you've got a large proportion of the population living in the cities. That was when in the mid-60s, but carrying on to the 70s is when the conflicts with Israel started to occur. And what that did was ratchet up the tensions between in the Muslim population. All of these fundamentalist philosophies and so on started to come up to the fore. And ever since then, the governments in these countries have been focused on keeping the peace. Their focus on economic development has been secondary, and that's that. And is that going to go away anytime soon? Probably not. So what you got there is two regions of the world which aren't really going to move in a fundamental reformist way to change what is essentially a pretty low metal consumption economy. Sub-Saharan Africa is a bit different. It really needs time. It isn't going to go anywhere to 2050 in the sense of high rate urbanisation. And we could talk about that in more detail, but I just don't think that's going to be where the next mining boom is going to come from. So let's focus on the last two regions, and that is Southeast Asia and the advanced countries. The advanced countries are pretty much past the metal-intensive stage. A mining boom is not going to come from the advanced countries, except renewable energy type minerals. And that's, I'll talk about that right at the end. But in terms of the traditional sort of urbanization driven metal consumption, the advanced countries are actually past it. It's not going to come from here. In fact, I put this table in at the end. Mostly the metal that's used in advanced countries now is actually recycled. You get buildings being torn down and rebuilt, and a lot of the metal that's in them is actually being reused. I think the US, which has a reasonably high steel consumption, nearly all of it is recycled steel. Copper less so because it's harder to get out. But it's a similar situation. So they're not going to cause an economic a mineral boom anyway, because even if they start to increase again, a lot of it is coming from recycling. What that table sort of is my estimate of what's going to happen globally, and it's mainly because I don't think China's going to do much, and so by 2050. Its steel consumption will be not much different to what it is. It'll be different, but not hugely different to what it is now. And a lot of the buildings that were built, 10 years ago will be torn down, and the steel will be used from there in the new buildings. So you're going to see this urban mining become a much bigger deal by 2050. That just leaves us with Southeast Asia. I think it's got the best prospect of driving a lot of a high mineral demand, and the reason is that it's kind of like the fourth cab off the rank in terms of low cost manufacturing. So low cost manufacturing, certainly in the post-war years, began. Sort of Japan was the first stronghold. And as its costs started to rise, it got transferred to the Asian Tigers, which is Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. When they followed the same path as Japan, it went on to China. The baton was passed to China. And finally, I think the baton will be passed to Southeast Asia. Now, you've got some history there already. It was nearly passed in the 1990s, but the Asian crisis came along. And the reason the Asian crisis came along in countries, Thailand and Malaysia, Indonesia versus China, was that the Southeast Asian countries were very reluctant to create the infrastructure needed to support manufacturing. Whereas the Chinese have never been that. They've always put infrastructure front and center. And so the first attempt at taking on low-cost manufacturing failed, but now you've got another bunch of countries coming along in the same region, Vietnam, Myanmar, Bangladesh, all with big populations and with that same outlook of building low-cost manufacturing. So I think if any region is going to be driving mineral demand, it will be Southeast Asia to 2050. The trouble is it's not going to come anywhere near what China did, because China is a bigger place in the first place, and there's a couple of a lot of urbanization has already occurred in these Southeast Asian countries. So I guess what I'm saying is that the period 2015 to 50 is going to be a mining boom free period. Nothing much is going to happen. They're my calculations for what they're worth, but the forecasts are always wrong. It's just to come up with something. I haven't just plucked these numbers out of the air. I did some calculations, but whatever the case, the numbers are saying that it's going to be up until 2050. The mineral demand is not going to see any mining booms globally. Now that can change if China begins to reform again, if India does its reforms properly, and if the advanced countries take climate change seriously. That could kick off a mining boom. Let's have a look at that last point. Renewable energy is very material intensive versus, say, carbon-based fuels. If you can have a power plant, coal-based power plant, which doesn't really occupy that much space. Yeah, obviously it's a big plant, but it can produce a hell of a lot of energy because the energy within coal is very intensive, very, very densely packed. with solar energy and wind energy, it's quite low intensive energy. So you need a lot more catchment area to catch the energy. And so it's a far more material intensive type of energy. And therefore, if the energy systems of the world are transformed from carbon to renewable, it's going to require a lot of materials. The trouble is that there are two, and it will need to start in the advanced countries. The reason is they use the most, by far, energy per person than anyone else. So they've really got the biggest responsibility. Now, there are a couple of questions. The first one being, when will this happen? I mean, at the moment, around about 4% of energy globally is produced from renewables, not including hydro. You're going to need to have a lot more than that. And so we need to start, when is the transformation going to start? That's the first question. And the second is, you know, the technologies that are there now, and I know a little bit about batteries, not that much, but yeah, lithium batteries are great. It's just that they're by no means the only material. So the question is, what materials will actually be used for when countries get serious about large-scale batteries, installations, and so on. But that's a more detailed. That's a question that requires a lot more detailed discussion, and we'll leave that for another day. I think I've said enough. So thank you for listening, and I will leave it there.
Thank you, Martin. That was a very interesting presentation. I'm just aware of the time, so I might just ask if there's one quick question from the audience.
Thank you. Thanks, Martin. That was wonderful. I heard an anecdote this week, so rather than a question, an observation, and it was an economist talking about the Asia and particularly, you know, Asia, India, Southeast Asia, excluding Indonesia, that the population would be growing at, I think it's 200 million people a year, which is basically adding a Germany every year just in our region. And what they referenced was numbers of consumers. So to your understanding about that consumerism rather than just numbers of people, I think that was the conversation. So I thought that was just an interesting anecdote.
All right, and now to close things off, I'll hand the microphone over to Tim.
Martin, congratulations on pulling a crowd. That's the first thing to say, because Zoom is a wonderful thing, but it's a two-edged sword, and it encourages people to sit at home in their pajamas and drink coffee rather than actually coming to be present here. And this is the best crowd I've seen in this lecture theatre for a long time. So it's lovely. It's a lovely thread of a story that the famous Friday morning seminars, to which you've just so eloquently contributed, were started by your father 50 years ago, and they're well known all over the place. Everyone who's been through this place is familiar with the challenge of giving a Friday morning seminar. And I think Zoom has rather detracted from the event, but you've reversed that trend, which is great. And by the way, I'm not going to say too much about Alban, but because it's all been said, but one thing, he was extraordinarily forward-looking. And talking about Zoom, Don will remember that Alban invested, I think, $40,000, must have been 30 years ago, in what was then called video conferencing. Now it's free, of course, but in those days it was the coming thing, and all the big mining companies had it. And Alban said, well, we've got to have it too, so that we can, you know, talk to these people in the way that they expect us to. And that was very forward-looking. I don't know what $40,000 then is worth now, but it's at least 100, I would think. The only thing I'm going to say about Alban is just to use this opportunity to acknowledge my debt to him personally and that of my family. He hired me in 1985, knowing nothing about me, really. He took a big risk. Whether that's paid off is not for me to say, but I think what it tells us, the little lesson that it gives us yet again about great leaders, is that they take those sorts of risks, and great leaders have enormous impacts on people, the people that they lead, and their families. And you know, I'm an example of that, I think. So, and by the way, the points that Don made about Alban, one could put it another way: ignorance is no bar. And that wonderful story about the blasting project, which started from a level of deep ignorance about everything to do with blasting. And Don gave a statistic. I'll just add to it. I'm pretty sure that project became the largest, not just the largest project here, which it still holds that record, but the largest industry-funded project in any topic in any Australian university. And I think there's a fantastic lesson there. Now, just finally, Martin, thank you so much for that really well researched and thought out story of the booms. And you just mentioned the big one that's really coming. I think they're right at the end, the one driven by an attempt to become, you know, so-called net zero by 2050. It's rapidly becoming apparent, I think, that that's not going to happen because there's just not enough stuff around. So that the next boom is going to be completely different, I suspect, to all the others. But what's so valuable about your talk to the people in this room is that we need to understand, particularly the students amongst you, that these cycles are endemic in mining. They've always been there. What Martin's done for us today is to explain, I think, very with a lot of research and background and thought, why they happen, the high-level decisions that are made by countries and political systems that actually drive the booms that we and the falls that we are so much affected by. Because, as you know, mining companies, when things are booming, they hire people, they invest money, they support research. And when the inevitable decline comes, they fire people, they stop investing money, and it's much harder to get money for research. So these cycles are absolutely integral to our professional lives. And I think the value of Martin's talk today is that for the first time, I've heard some plausible arguments about why they happen. And we can project that into the future to use Martin's approach, because I think that's going to teach us a lot about what's going to come next. So I think it's been a great morning's education for us. And Martin, thank you so much for coming and continuing that great tradition of the Friday morning seminar started by your father all those years ago. Thank you.
Thank you.